went through a 33 or 35% depopulation rate in 3 years, from 1341 or 1340 to 1343. And that was the bubonic plague. And the bubonic plague was following a horrible famine that had already gotten people sick, right? And so, same thing's going to happen in North America. So I'll come to that in a few minutes. All right, so these mound builders in central North America stretch from Pennsylvania all the way out to the Great Plains, down to the Gulf of Mexico, up to the Great Lakes. And here in green were people that were, we call Hopewell or Adena culture, two different cultures that were about 2,000 years ago. Out here along the Mississippi River is another culture we call Mississippi. We can identify that there are three different cultures from the things they left behind, right? From their artwork, from their horticulture, from their tools, from the buildings that they built, right? And we can tell from that they have different religious structures, different political beliefs, all that. So there's three different, but they're all building these big earthen mounds. Just like we're built in Peru, just like we're built in Mesoamerica, they're building here, right? So for example, about 2,000 years ago, down near Chillicothe, Ohio, this is the Great Serpent Mound. You have to be several hundred feet in the air in order to see the whole thing, right? It's a couple of miles long if you stretch it all out. It's about 12 to 25 feet in height at one point, and about 12 to 15, or about, 15 to 20 feet, 25 feet across at any point, at different points. And so what it is a great serpent, and he's either swallowing an egg or an egg is coming out of the serpent. It's probably coming out of the serpent, you know. So what's going on here, I believe, just knowing what I know about various 17th, 18th, 19th century Indians and their beliefs, snakes, especially in the eastern part of the United States, were almost universally revered as an animal. And one of the reasons why is like, never harm a snake. Why? You get too close to harm a snake, the snake's going to harm you. So part of that reverence is, that thing's deadly, right? So you want to stay back from it. However, they live among the earth, right? Among the earth. They come from it. They come up out of the earth. And native peoples, who were horticultural by this time, saw the earth as their primary source of life. And so these things that came, this life that seems to come out of the ground, most of them believed themselves that they too came up out of the ground. And they can see snakes doing that, so snakes have this thing. And snakes lay eggs, and eggs are a symbol of fertility. So this is some sort of a fertility symbol, right, that they're building for themselves. It's about religion, it's about architecture, it's about beauty, it's about all those things. It's also about food storage, it's about human burial of remains. They use this for all sorts of things. And so this is evidence of a large civilization, of several cities, of thousands of people who could organize people to build this structure, because it took years, again, to do it. And the people building it weren't making food while they're building this structure. Coming closer to us, this is the Grave Creek Mound in Moundsville, West Virginia, not far from Wheeling. So if you go to visit Meadowcroft, you can get on I-70 and just flip right into West Virginia. You'll see Moundsville, get off, drive to the prison. This sits right next to the prison. And so this is a pyramid, right? Earthen pyramid. It's pretty big at the base, you know. It's about 50 yards, right, by each corner at the base. And it's a good, I'd say, 65, 70 feet high, right? It's a good size earthen pyramid. So that means that in this area, right, between the Monongahela and the Ohio River, right, in that peninsula, which people describe when they show you West Virginia, it kind of looks like this. It's the middle finger part of West Virginia, right? Right, so right up there, they were farming up there, right, for years and years, and had a large civilization. Again, thousands of people, cities, they're able to build things like this. Here's one a little closer to home. And you can see it's on the exact same kind of structure as this one. Anybody recognize this little lump? No? Anybody live up towards Johnstown and ever go up to the mound, the ballpark at Westmont? This is the mound at Westmont.
I drank a lot of beer on that.
Yeah. Right. So this is a 2,000 plus year old Indian mound. There are people in the Johnstown area who dispute this. No, there's a water tank under that. This is not a water tank. This is not what that would look like, right? And there's another mound. So if you're up by this mound and you drive down Buckdale Avenue, you'll come to a place where there's tennis courts and a baseball diamond and a huge flag that sits on top of the incline. So if you've ever been to Johnstown, it's that big flag, so right there. So if you go to the top of the incline, you're standing at the incline, you look behind you, there's stairs. And they go up, 30 steps. You're walking up a pyramidal mound. An earthen mound built about 1,000 years ago by the Mississippians. And they came and built one right next to this one. Now that mound has been shaved down probably about 40 feet to build a baseball field on top of it, and a basketball court, and a children's play area. But you can go around it and still see the dimensions of that mound, which was enormous. On top of that mound, again, it rose another 40 feet up, would have been structures that a principal chief, right, usually also their religious figure, maybe their connection to God, because there are two gods, were an earth mother and a sun god, the two things you need to grow gourds and sunflowers and bright goosefoot and marsh shelter. And these are all the things that they were growing and surviving on here in western Pennsylvania from about 2,000 years ago to a little over 1,000 years ago. So in this mound building area, 2,000 years ago, you can go over to Pittsburgh and still see evidence of these mounds. So this is a drawing in the 19th century of the side of a mound that had been cut into. Here's what it looked like by the end of the 19th century when archaeologists and anthropologists from the University of Pittsburgh and their graduate students went over with steam shovels and dug the thing apart. There are human remains, there are tools, there are ceremonial things that still sit in Pittsburgh in a dusty basement that still have not been repatriated to people who we know are related to these mound builders who would love to have these things back. This is part of our problem that we still have today, is that there are tremendous numbers of things, including human remains, that are still sitting in universities or in my own, right? And in museums that are still not being repatriated. Just today in the news, I saw a story about the British Museum finally agreeing to repatriate some things to Nigeria that are thousands of years old that they took when they colonized Nigeria in the 19th century. And so this is really slow stuff, but you can still see that today. There it is, right? So it is at McKees Rocks. So if you drive over the bridge, if you go up, I think it's 28, or not 28, 51 or something, it goes up the river from the stadiums. It goes up the Ohio River. And you turn over that bridge that goes into McKees Rocks. As soon as you cross that bridge, it's there on the left, right? So it's still there. People drive by it every day, have no idea they're looking at an ancient civilization right in their midst. So if we go to 1,200 years ago, we come down to this American Southwest by the Four Corners region, you find Puebloan culture. This is in the classic era. This, if anybody's ever been there, has any ever been to Chaco Canyon in New Mexico? Wow, I've been there. That place is amazing, right? Or to anybody ever been to Santa Fe? Or to Taos, right? Or maybe over to the Grand Canyon in Arizona. And so you drive through Hopi land, right? So these people are Hopi and Navajo, right? And there are several others that live here, but we refer to them collectively because they're all from the same culture as a Puebloan culture. For years, until a few years ago, it was popular to call this whole culture Anasazi. But Anasazi was not a name they gave themselves. It was a name that the Apache, who lived on the plains and who were enemies of these people and fought them, that was the Apache word for these people collectively, which in the Apache language means asshole, right? So don't ever go to the Four Corners region and refer to those people there as Anasazi. They will get very offended very quickly, and for good reason, right? So this is something you should be aware of, right? Because we have the same thing, and it's me. We're constantly, as Indian people, keep speaking up and saying, "You're not calling us the right name. Call me my name," right? So, these names will change as we, being 21st century non-native people, allow them to tell us what they want to be called. And so you go to the Southwest today and say, call us Puebloans. You don't have to call me Hopi, you don't have to call me Navajo, just call me a Puebloan, refer to us that way, just don't use that Anasazi term. Right? Have you ever heard the term Sioux? S-I-O-U-X, to describe natives, right? That's not their term, and it has nothing to do with those people. They call themselves Lakota, right? Dakota, right? And they have a number of national tribal names, none of which are Sioux. Sioux is a term that I think Assiniboines up in Canada, they use this term to tell French Canadians who these people were, and it's very similar to the Anasazi story. Just don't use the terms people want to be called. So anyway, Puebloan people, that's my final switch. And living out here. Now, if you've been here, you know that New Mexico, Arizona, southern Colorado, southeastern Utah, that these are desert places. These are very dry places. They were less dry 1,000 years ago, 800 years, 900 years ago, than they are now. But they were still dry places. And yet, whole civilizations developed there. So this is in Taos. This is the North Pueblo in Taos. A few people in the room have probably seen this. Maybe even been in it. I got to go inside a couple of different apartments. It has been continuously occupied by hundreds of people. Back in 1200, probably 1,200 people. For 900 years. There are still Puebloan people living in this building today. Families have each one of these apartments, and they take turns living in it throughout the year to make sure that their apartment stays lived in. Right? 900 years, right? Or actually a little more than that, maybe 1,000 years. I think they think about 900 to 1,000 AD is when this was built, so more like 1,100, 1,200 years. And how did they do it? Well, they did it with grain. They grew maize as well. That maize agriculture came out of Mesoamerica. The Olmecs brought it through Texas into the Mississippi River Valley. And their culture spread. And so what we're going to see in a lot of these things, and when you think about the pyramids that we saw in Mesoamerica, the Mayans, you're going to see these things repeated. Because where maize spread, that culture also spread. From continent to continent. I don't know if that surprises you, but when I started learning that 30 years ago, it blew my mind, right? That there was that kind of movement and sharing, intercontinental movement and sharing in the Western Hemisphere. So they did it with maize, and here are women grinding corn. This is a mortar and pestle that was from the reason that they would use to grind that corn, and grind it into cornmeal and preserve it for, a year, 2 years, right? It's portable, you can put it on your back and carry it, add some water, cook it, right? It's a great, great resource, and it allows them to build this in the desert. So what they had to do to grow maize, but also chili, beans, and cotton. They had a textile industry, have a textile industry that's well over 1,000 years old. So they did all of this and formed a civilization in the desert by irrigating the Colorado River and the Rio Grande River, right? Both. The same way that you and I have eaten today. Those two rivers. And the way that they've been irrigated, right? Right now you heard about the droughts that are going on in the Southwest and California. Right? And people are like, oh yeah, well, don't wash your car. Right? Human consumption of that water through drinking, through showers, right? Washing your car, watering your lawn, is less than 5% of all that water that's being used out there. 95% is in your biome right now. Right? It's what we eat. It's farmland. They were doing that, learning how to dam these rivers and to channel them into their farmland well over 1,000 years ago. And once you get to about 1,000 years ago, about 1,000 or 1,100, you see the rise in the east of the Mississippian civilization along the Mississippi River. This was not just a civilization, but it was a mighty empire. The civilization probably began building 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, but by 1,000 ACE, it's an empire. In this green area, here's the capital. It's in southwestern Illinois, at a city called Cahokia. From Cahokia, they controlled smaller cities up and down the Mississippi River, and then they relied on those smaller cities to control other civilizations all the way to western Pennsylvania to the east, to the Great Plains in the west and the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, all the way up to the Great Lakes and down to the Gulf of Mexico. We know about that range because at Cahokia, what has been discovered there have been items, thousands of pieces from all over eastern North America. Seashells from Florida, obsidian from Minnesota, right? Things that don't exist anywhere near southwestern Illinois. And they built huge earthen pyramids, including this one. This is Monk's Mound, the Great Pyramid at Cahokia. I don't know if I have that image, I don't have it. But Monk's Mound, looking at it, doesn't look like much. This is a photograph taken from an airplane, probably a half a mile away. It's enormous. Has anybody ever been to Egypt and seen the Great Pyramid of Giza? You haven't? Well, imagine it. It's big. This is bigger. The base of this pyramid is 1.4 times larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Now, this is a flat top step pyramid. This one big base with another pyramid built on top. You go up to the top of this pyramid. Now, it was built as a pyramid. This is the thing we're going to talk about pyramids. So if you go back to the Mesoamerican Mayans, building pyramids, perfect pyramids, all the way up here, right? So from about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago to 1,000 years ago here. This pyramid, now there's been wearing over time. People have dug into it. But we know that it's a perfect pyramid. That if you took the 4 points below this top section and you drew a line up to a center point, they would come exactly together and there's 4 sides of you. Perfect. There's only one way to do that. We know. There's only one way to build a pyramid that way. And we know the Egyptians had this and did it. The Egyptians developed trigonometry to solve the problem. So did the Mayans. So did the Mississippians. And they did it on a scale that no human beings have ever built pyramids before. This is the largest earthen structure ever built by human beings. If you took this pyramid and finished it to a point at the top, it would be higher than the Great Pyramid of Giza. But they weren't building these for ornamental purposes only. On top of this would have lived their central religious and political leader. And then people down here, there have been houses built down here that people have been close to him. Right? His cabinet, right? His advisors, right? People in the nobility would have lived right up there. And this would have considered to be, why build this thing? Why build something so small and so high? Because their leader, who's going to live atop this, they believed was a representative of the sun god. And it's that sun that they rely upon for planting and harvest all the time. And so they give that leader the responsibility. Guess what happens if there's a drought? The leader's gone. You're going to find somebody else, who's got a better connection, a better phone line to the sun god. So that's Monk's Mound. And here's to put it in perspective. It's tiny by the size of the city that surrounds it. And it's just one of dozens of pyramids. This city, again, 1,000 years ago, was somewhere, some people say between 30 and 50,000. There are others that say 50 to 80,000. Either way, larger and more dense than any city in Europe at the same time. Bigger than London, bigger than Paris, any place that you can imagine in Europe. And here you see, this is a fortification. It's a fortified city, so it's got a wall. Why? Because they had enemies. They had enemies because they created enemies on purpose. They went out to attack other people and to make them tributaries, to force them into a tributary relationship so that other people would grow corn, beans, and squash for them so that they could continue to develop, right? And so they were always on guard because their own tributaries would attack them. So you build a walled city, and when the attack comes, you go inside. But otherwise, everybody lives outside. And what you see going on here is a number of things, right? So here's all the farm fields, there and over there, back this way, where they're growing what they call the Three Sisters. And they call them the Three Sisters because they grow them together in hillocks. Corn, beans, and squash. I'm going to show you an image of that in a few minutes. So they're growing that out there, but they're also doing another kind of farming. See all these pits with water in them? Here's the creek that flows into the Mississippi River back here. What they've done to build these pyramids is they dug holes all over the place, right, to get that dirt. And then they channeled water from the creek into these. They would fish for trout and sunfish, and catfish, and they would stock them in these ponds. Fish farming. Right? So here's one of the lies that we've always been told. Well, Indians didn't engage in any animal husbandry. Baloney! They were managing animal populations all the time. They didn't build a fence for cattle, right? Or for pigs, right? Or for anything like that. But they managed those animals. They didn't build a fence for their deer, but they absolutely managed them, where they would be, and having access to them. I'll show you that in just a few minutes. And that's part of the horticultural experience of viticulture, right? Because we don't just eat things we grow. We eat things that we grow, right? And so that's a really important part of horticulture and agriculture that they had developed and were using. It's another image. This is the one that was on the front of my talk, just to give you a sense of scale of what this looked like at the time. Now, here's the neat thing about this pyramid. Just if I go back, wrong one. There. If you go to Egypt today and you say, hey, I'd like to walk right up to the Great Pyramid and touch it and maybe crawl up it a little bit, you don't get anywhere near this thing. They stick you on a bus, they take you out to about a quarter mile away. You're, oh, there it is, right? See, isn't that neat? And they put you on the bus, let's go see the Sphinx. This one, you go to the museum and you see the amazing collection of things they have that they've dug up all around here. And the reason they have so much is, see this right here? This is the Illinois State Highway that they built in 1947. And they just tore right through the middle of the place. But when they did it, fortunately it was after 1947, and the United States had the National Historic Preservation Commission, right? And so anytime you go to build a road, it's like, all right, first we gotta do an archaeological survey, call in the state historic preservation officers, state archivists, right, from Illinois. They come in, they start digging around, right? Put off the building of that road for about 3 years, and they have a massive collection of artifacts that are there, sitting in Cahokia, right in the city, to this day. So native peoples, when they see that museum, they're all about it. Because the human remains and the stuff those people made is sitting right on the land where their ancestors are, where they died and where their people died. It wasn't looted, right? And the state runs it. But when you go to that museum, they will give you a map and say, well, be sure to go and walk up to the top of the mound. The view is incredible. And when I heard that, I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Okay, walk down and walk all the way to the top of this thing. And from there, 7 miles off, and look at St. Louis. I can see the arch, right? You can see the city. There it is. Like, wow, it's so neat. So, and that's something you do. How many of you have ever been to St. Louis? All right, now how many of you have seen Monk's Mound in Cahokia? 1. Yeah, that's about right. I thought about 8 of you raised your hand, about 1 out of 8. You were within 6 miles of it. A UNESCO World Heritage Site. The most impressive thing you will see within 100 miles of St. Louis. And you probably went up in that arch or went to the museum underneath it and thought you saw the neatest thing. Go back and see this. So, and then after them, what happens with them? Well, about 1300 to 1400, we had a meteorological event that at the beginning of what meteorologists call the Little Ice Age that we have come out of in the last 100 years. It spanned from about 1300 until the early 1900s. And the worst of it was from about 1320 to about 1400 for all of us on the planet. That sparked a famine that went the world around. So, as I said to you before, the Great Bubonic Plague hits Europe in the 1340s. It hits about 20 to 25 years after the beginning of this global cooling event. The Earth lost about 1 degree centigrade from its average daily temperature. And that 1 degree centigrade took the growing season, which had been, right, up here, you could grow grain, and pushed it all the way down here. And it destroyed those Mississippians. What did they do? They all moved from here down to here. Who are the Mississippians today? They are Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Cherokees, and a variety of people who we call Seminole. Now, all of those names are names that get created after these disasters. And then, of course, these people would then go through a decimating event between 1492 and 1600, thanks to the disease, right? Columbus comes in down here, 1492, brings in smallpox, chickenpox, rhinovirus, the common cold, the flu. None of those things existed here. And all of those ran through people who had absolutely no antibodies to them. And then you had another big dying event. So, putting back into perspective what those first Europeans saw in 1620 or 1630, they're arriving after 300 years of turmoil on these continents and massive, massive death. Right? So, the death comes from first starvation, which leads to people who are malnourished, who then have these diseases hit them. The exact same thing happened in Europe, but much quicker, right? In Europe, as starvation hit, a bubonic plague came in 1340s. They lost a third of their population in about 3 years. And then over the course of the next 40 or 50 years, another third. Right? So 2/3 in a century. Here, it would be 9/10 in 3 centuries. But again, we're all dealing with it, right? It's happening to everybody around the planet. So, but once you get up to about 1500, things get a little better, right? And agriculture starts spreading northward again, all back up to this way. It's getting better. It's still cooler than it had been before 1300, but it's good enough. And so you start to see the redevelopment of civilizations. And it's a massive event that anthropologists call ethnogenesis. And so what people did is you might have come from 3 or 4 different language groups, 8 or 9 different tribes or nations, and yet to have enough people to do the farming that you need to survive and then to take care of each other, they had to merge together to form new nations. And that happened all over the continent. And so just about any Indian nation, all Indian nations that exist today, they're all hybrids of others. So are the English, so are the Spanish, so are the Germans, so are the Nigerians, so are the Chinese. This is the story of humanity, because we all do that. What happens in Europe during the bubonic plague and the famine? Warfare. What are they doing? Taking over each other. Why? To take people from each other. Right? Forcing people to speak new languages, worship new gods, right? Dress differently. All of those things happens all over the world. Happens here too. So this is nothing different than what everybody else is dealing with. You just have to kind of put it into perspective. Well, how do they bounce back from it? And they do, through their horticulture. So you see vast societies begin to rebuild in the 1400s and in the 1500s, even as disease is coming. Now, disease comes here first, but it travels. Why does it travel? Because Indians in North America travel, and they trade with one another, and they communicate with one another. Going back to New Mexico, 1,200 years ago, they built Chaco Canyon, which is a massive collection of 13 huge apartment buildings that could hold anywhere between 800 and 1,500 people, each one. 13 of them in one valley. And that valley, every summer, would fill up with between 10 and 20,000 people who came from the American East Coast, from Alaska, from Mesoamerica, all to the Four Corners region every summer for a huge trade fair that connected together the North American continent. They have stories about this. They know who one another are and what resources they have, and they trade with one another. And so as a result, when the disease comes in here, maybe DeSoto comes up through here in 1539, right, for 2 years and burns and kills his way through the southeast, destroying mounds, destroying people, enslaving people, all of that, spreading disease. Well, that disease starts to spread northward, right? 1540s, the Spanish form St. Augustine. By the 1560s, we know the Spanish are making forays into the Carolinas. By 1570, they're in the Chesapeake. Now, this is 40 years before Jamestown, 60 years before Plymouth, right? And so, in the 50s, they're all there. At the same time, the English and the French and Belgians and Norwegians and Swedes were fishing off the Grand Banks in the 1500s. And they were establishing seasonal fishing villages from Newfoundland all the way down to Cape Cod. fishing for those codfish that William Williamson talked about. And so they had these fishing villages every summer. They would go back. You know, we believe, well, the first Europeans don't get here until 1620 in Plymouth, right? 1607, Jamestown, right? 1541 in St. Augustine, right? 1480, first fishing village on Newman. 1480. That's 12 years before Columbus. I thought he discovered North America. He didn't, right? And these are the people getting here in 1480. The people who have been here for 40,000 years have discovered it, right? So, at any rate, they're fishing villages. And Indians come to those fishing villages to trade. And so for 120 years, 140 years, before people settled in Plymouth or settled in the Chesapeake, they knew Indian people. They knew their language. There were books with Indian language written down in English, back in England, so that people who were going could be able to get there and say, let's see, how do I ask them where the bathroom is? Right? You know, this existed. So when Europeans meet Indians when they're settling in the 1600s, it was not a first encounter. Not by a long shot. Right? So a lot of this stuff. So to think back about the surprise that they're registering about the land they're seeing is really almost a willful decision to not believe their own eyes and what they've really known for more than 100 years. That's what we're capable of as people if we're pursuing something in our own interest. There's pilgrims. They wanted a place to build a church that was pure, that would not be tainted by any other belief. And they thought that this would be a good place to do it. The people down in Virginia 13 years before wanted to get rich quick and get home. You know, that's what they wanted to do. They were looking to make money as fast as they could and get the heck out. But both of them were able to suspend belief in what they saw in order to pursue what they wanted. Right? And that's a very human trait. People do that. So you've got many, many societies. Up here, mostly people speaking Algonquin languages, with the exception of the Iroquois speakers here, the Iroquois League, the Haudenosaunee, who you might know as the Six Nations of Indians, right, that live here. They're surrounded by Algonquin speakers. Down here in the southeast, you have those 5 nations I talked about who all came from the Mississippians. They speak Cree or Muskegon family of languages. But there's also Algonquins down here, there's some Iroquois speakers, and that's because the whole continent has been kind of, thrown in the bag and shaken up by the famine and then by the disease. And then everything gets thrown back out on the table, and people are kind of scattered everywhere. But if you look into these people and what they live like, here is a typical town in the eastern woodlands. This could be either an Algonquin village or an Iroquois one, or even a Cree-speaking one. But notice they have streets, they have houses, they have very neat farm fields, right? They've got all kinds of they've got places here for ceremony, religion, dance. They have storehouses. They have different things going on in different places. These are sedentary people. These are the Indians that Europeans would meet in the 17th century. They lived in towns, they lived in villages, they had farms, right? Families, single-family dwellings among the Algonquins, right? Usually mom, dad, sometimes a uncle or an aunt would live in with them, right? Never their father or mother, because Algonquins don't have a patrilineal family relationship. They're all matrilineal, and so the family follows the mother's line, and they also believe that your own children, that parents are too close to their children to raise them, right? And that parents get too upset with their own children. And so Algonquins are very easy with their children, very easy and lax. And so instead of having the parents raise the children, the mother's sister raises her sister's children. And so it's an aunt and uncle who are really your mother and father. And I don't know about you, I'm an uncle. I'm also a father. I am much more forgiving of things that my nieces and nephews do than my own kids. Hey, get on it! If it's my own, I'm immediately on them. If it's a niece and nephew, I'm like, oh, they're fine, let them go, And we're all kind of like that. And so they did. So this is an Algonquin village. What did they do? How did they farm? Well, they practiced slash and burn. So they would go into a farm area, where they wanted to farm in the woods, and they would slash at the trunks of trees and just let the trees die. The next year, they'd come back, no leaves, sunlight hitting the floor. Well, they would start farming right there. Why bother cutting the tree down? And then the work of digging up the stump? Who does that? Even if you have an ox to do it for you, It's a day, right? Who wants to spend time doing that? Indians weren't interested in working hard. They were interested in enjoying the fruits of their labor, right? They have a different work ethic. So the people who come over and meet them first, a lot of them are Puritans, Pilgrims, people who we know who established the quote-unquote Protestant work ethic. Right? What should you be doing from the moment you wake up until the moment you go to sleep? Work, 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 do something responsible, get something done. My mother beat this into me as a child all the time. Are you doing anything constructive? I love a kid. You know? So that's how they're they're developing what they want to do, and so their labor kind of matches that belief that life's to be enjoyed, not just toil. And so it's slash and burn. So once you slash those trees, the next year you come back and you will burn out the understory. So the smaller trees will burn up in this forest fire. The bigger ones will just stand and remain. But what you're doing here now is you're adding sunlight to the ground that hasn't seen sunlight in years. And you're also introducing nitrogen and carbon into the ground. And then you start farming. And the people who do the farming, notice it's men who will do the slashing and the burning. The farmers are the women in the eastern woodlands. Men do not farm. They would never farm because the women wouldn't allow them to. So this is something that women develop. It's a knowledge they develop that leads to them having power. The power it gives them. In Algonquin society, this is the power that makes all their families matrilineal. Right? It's grandmothers who pass on knowledge to mothers who pass on knowledge to daughters. And they don't allow their sons and grandsons to come in the fields to work with them. So they can't have the knowledge, right? And that's that knowledge that gives them power of their families. Now, in Algonquin society, it'll be the women in the families who will decide who the leader is going to be. Now, it's going to be a woman who's a queen, right? And it's going to be her child, right? And her daughter's children and her granddaughter's children who would decide who would be the leaders. But there's many, many children, right? You might have 5 or 6 that you could choose from. It would be that central queen who would say, this one will lead us, or this one will lead us no more, now this one. And so they called the shots. If you go to Iroquois, women had even more power. They took this power over farming, and they formed a council of elder women called the Owakira. And each nation, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Seneca, the Cayuga, and Mohawks, all had Owakiras, which were a council of their elder women, who would then vote in each one of their nations for their leadership and for representatives to go to Onondaga to lead the Iroquois League, right? They're the 6 nations, 5 nations. So tremendous amount of political power that women most around the world don't have. When Europeans come and they see this, they think that Indian men are lazy and they've made the Indian women their slaves. And yet, the truth was the opposite, right? It was the women who had the power, right, in this society. Now, men had power too, and there's a sharing of responsibility that goes on, but there is a gender-specific division of labor just like exists in the rest of the world. It's just that the duties given to each gender are different, right? So here, women have a bit more say, and here are the tools they used. They used stone tools bound to wooden handles with animal sinew. So here you see the tools men are using, hatchets and axes that you use to cut into a tree. The women are using this. And does this look familiar to you? What is that tool? Oh, right? Otherwise known as a cultivator. Right? That's a stick with the shoulder blade of a deer tied up with the deer's sinew, and you can work the ground with it that way. Here's a picture of one that I took at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter a couple summers ago. What it looks like, and there you can grab it and say, sure, use it. You can actually dig in the ground, and the kids get to do that. It's a really cool thing. So here is one of the hillocks that eastern woodland Indians would have grown the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash. And I got this picture at an experimental place. It's down near, it's down in eastern Virginia, not far from Williamsburg. But I waited until the volunteer was working, the gardener was out there, and it's a woman walking through her garden. And I thought, this is perfect. I gotta wait for this. I got the perfect shot. It's like, this is exactly how it would have been. And so what you're seeing here is the corn coming up after the squash leaves have already blossomed out. And as that corn is rising, there are beanstalks climbing up the corn stalks. And so it looks, this is a simple image, but it kind of looks like that. And so you've got all kinds of different squash. Zucchini squash, yellow squash, acorn zucchini, different varieties of pumpkin, right? Gourd. There's bunches of them that they've been growing. Those will leaf out first, right? Kind of protecting the young corn stalk as it gets started and the young bean stalk. But then that corn stalk, you know how fast that grows, boom, it starts popping up. By the middle of May, beginning of June, it's knee-high, and that's the time, late May, make sure your beans are going, and zoop, they start crawling up, and they grow together that way. And you don't have to chop down a single tree, you don't have to pull out a single stump. You don't need to worry about planting in rows, because they support one another. The reason we grow corn in those rows and so tight together is to force it to grow up and what have you, right? And we do it that way. Well, this way you just plant everything, push everything together, and you don't have to worry about being neat and orderly, and it's incredibly productive. Now, the other side of this is what you get out of it, and this is where we're coming to today. So I'm driving down the road this morning, and I'm remembering what's in my refrigerator. As soon as I get home, I'm the cook in the house, and I have to start cooking for my wife. She's working now. She'll be off at 4 o'clock. She'll be starving by 5. And so I've got some chicken in the fridge. I'm like, I throw that on the grill. And I'm like, what do we have left over in the CSA? I'm like, in my mind's eye, I'm like, oh, I know I've got 1 green zucchini. I've got an ear of corn. Oh, and I've got half a little box of green beans. What do I have? Succotash. That's what that is, right? So what I'm going to do tonight, I'm going to take, I always keep a jar of bacon grease in my fridge because I'm my grandmother's son. And so I'll take 2 tablespoons of that bacon grease and I'll throw it in my black iron skillet. And I'll heat it to that medium. And I'll put about 3 cloves of garlic in there for if I'm feeling spicy, right? And get that going. And then I'll take my zucchini, right? And my beans. I'll cut the beans into thirds. I'll cut my zucchini up in about 3/4 inch chunks. And I'll take my corn, take it right off, throw it all in, 5 minutes. That's it. Stir. Take it out. Fresh chopped green onion right on top of it. Oh, God. Right? I cannot wait to get home and eat dinner, right? But that was a normal dinner. How would they prepare it? Same way I just did. They take some dinner. Yeah, right. They take some animal fat. They throw it in an old hollowed out gourd, right? They sit that next to the fire on top of a stone that they've been heating. It'll get nice and hot on the inside. They throw in their garlic, and yes, they were growing garlic. Many varieties of it. You know, when Europeans arrive and they see the kinds of quote-unquote wild garlic that grows in the United States, you know, or in North America, they're amazed by it. It's not wild garlic. They have been managing this stuff for 1,000 years, right? Developing these things. So, at any rate, you know, this kind of thing, to do the exact same, and they would throw their vegetables in and let it go for just a few minutes. Delicious, right? So that's succotash. And, you know, that's something that has been part of my family. I don't remember not eating succotash. My mom would put the lima beans in it. Ugh, I hate lima beans. Put green beans in it? Oh, is it good, right? Oh, look. So, at any rate, here's another thing about it, is that these 3 things, not only do they grow together so well, and they get great crop yield with very little work, the corn has enzymes in it that, if eaten with the beans, unlock the specific proteins to beans that our bodies need. It's incredible. And so, when John Smith arrives, now John Smith is a guy, and this is a picture from his book. This shows John Smith meeting the king of the Palamon, 1608. He wrote a book in 1614 about coming to Virginia in 1607. Smith was 5 feet 4 inches tall, which made him short. Right? He was short for an Englishman. At the time, the average Englishman was about 5'7". Today, the average height of a man in the United States is the same height as the average height of a man throughout the world. You know what it is? 5'8". 5'8" is average. For women, 5'5". English men at this time, 5'6" to 5'7". English women, 5'3" to 5'4". About an inch shorter. Why? Protein deficiency. The Indians here he had this Indian drum. Look at this guy. He's a giant. Right? He's gigantic. He's not gigantic. You know what he is? He's about 5'10", 5'11". Average height of an Indian today. Average height of a man, right, is 5'8". Average height of a male Indian, 1600, is about 5'9", 5'10". And yet, every European describing them as they first would meet them would say they are giants. They're huge. The women are huge, right? Because the women were 5'7" to 5'8". The men were 5'9" to 5'10". European men, 5'8", women, 5'4", 5'5", right? 5'7", 5'4". So they're not giants, right? But they're much bigger. The reason they're much bigger is this. They eat better, right? You might think, but they don't have cattle and pigs. They're not eating pork and beef. Well, guess what? The average European wasn't eating pork and beef. The average European was eating gruel, right? Or a porridge made out of oats, barley, rye, right? Maybe they would have some meat every third day. But they were eating mostly a vegetarian diet. And because of that, they were protein deficient. And the vegetables they were eating were not things high in protein. As opposed to these people, right? They were also getting meat, though. They were getting meat from deer. How were they getting that, right? So, and one other product that they grew. I'm sorry?
Fish.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Fishing, huge, right? Another agricultural product, tobacco. I forgot to bring up. But it was from their way of farming, called swing agriculture. And so here's a graphic that kind of gives you the idea. You might be born in this village, village number 1. And when you're born there, it's a farming village. And so there's houses and streets and farm fields. There might be ponds that are stocked with bluegill, right? Whatever you need. Well, after about 20 years, the crop yields start to drop because you have been sucking the nitrogen and the carbon out of the soil. And so that every 20 years they'll move. And so you move just a few miles away, maybe 30, and you slash and burn another farm field and you build another village to live in for 20 years. What happens to this one? A year later, you're no longer farming it. Everything starts growing back up again by itself. And all the deer and the fox and the bunny rabbits like to come back in and munch on that soft stuff. And so the men will simply, at hunting time, will go back and make this farming village. The same houses are there. They go back and live in those, and that's their hunting camp. And they hunt around the same fields, and it's easy. They just go in, they sit and they wait. Boom, right? They set their traps right along where they know these animals are going to be. And they head back here, and they supplement their horticultural food with meat, right? And so they do that for 20 years. And then after 20 years, this village, same thing, right? Meanwhile, they move here, create another farming village. They come back here to hunt. This has been sitting fallow for 20, and then another 20 years. Finally, after this one starts to dry out, they move back to the very place you began your life. And you go back there to farm again. You go back here to hunt, and these two sit fallow. And after 40 years of sitting fallow, this land is ready. Right? 40 years means there are mature oak trees that didn't exist when you left. And so you burn all that out, all that stuff goes in the ground, you start over again. This is your life. It's not nomadic. You know where you're going to be. You know when you're born where you're going to die. And it's the same place you're born. And you know where you're going to come into adulthood. And you know where you're going to live. Right? You're higher in years, right? You know, that's where you know you're going to be. But Europeans, when they would walk into a village and see no one in it, thought that it had been abandoned, and claimed it for their own. And the next thing you know, Indian men show up going to hunt in order to feed themselves and their families, and they find settlers living in their houses, farming in their fields, scaring away all of the game. Now, I say this to students all the time. It's just hard for us to imagine, but you know, if you want to really imagine it, there are places on the globe today where you can go and see this exact same phenomenon still going on. We still do this to human beings. It still happens in the Middle East. It still goes on in Africa, in South Sudan, right now, in Palestine, right now, where people find that places that have been their home for decades or even centuries, all of a sudden settlers from another culture move in, and with the authority of a government, take control of land, houses, resources. So, I mean, this stuff, we still do this to each other in the world. This is what happens. So, anyway, so moving very quickly to Pennsylvania, just to kind of fill you in on the Indians who are around here. This is greater Pennsylvania in the 1500s. And so you had tremendous numbers of civilizations here, but less people. You go back to 1200, 1300, there were tens of thousands of people living in Pennsylvania. You get to the middle of the 1500s, there are thousands, right? So the numbers have come down. But they are divided by river valleys, the Delaware, the Susquehanna, the Allegheny and Ohio River Valley, and also by the mountains. right, that run up from the southeast and head out to the east. And so you have really 6 different zones and different cultures of people living in Pennsylvania, all living very similar, right? They have different languages, different religions, right, different cultures, but the same kinds of horticulture. And they come into contact with Europeans later than others. You see, you go into the southeast, the Spanish have been down there through the 1500s. You go into the northeast, the English and the Belgians and the Norwegians have been there since 1480, right? Coming down to Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, right, this area, right, in this central mid-Atlantic, it's not until the early 1600s. So it's a century later. And so that insulates Indians in this region from all that disease, and they're able to kind of rebuild themselves, you know, get themselves back up and running, and they're also able to deal with Europeans from a position of strength when they arrive, whereas the others are dealing from weakness. So, for example, the Dutch come in, and they settled the Delaware River Valley in 1608, and they start setting up little settlements, trading with Indians, and in the 1630s, they create a permanent settlement at Cape Henlopen, which is in Delaware today. It's down here where Lewis Ferry is, where Lewis, Delaware is. Right. That was what they called Swannendale. And the Indians had known these Swedes for years. Right. Swedes were a pretty big empire at the time. It always surprised people. Like, Sweden was the first to colonize? You know, first the Dutch, and then the Swedes, right? Came right after. Yeah. But anyway, so the Dutch and the Swedes. And the Dutch first, Swannendale, they formed, and for 30 years they dealt with Indians, trading with them. They build this place at Swannendale, at Lewis, and they plant a bronze marker in the ground to claim the land for New Netherland. And it was that action that the local Indians in the Delaware River Valley, we call them Delaware Indians, they call themselves Lenni Lenape, which means the original people. Other Indians throughout eastern North America called them the grandfather people, because the Lenni Lenape claimed to be the first people to come to North America and to make it to the East Coast, and other Indians all around them recognize them as such, still to this day. Right? So these Lenni Lenape see the Dutch plant this bronze marker as if the land belonged to them, and they said, you know what, that's enough. They went in and murdered every single one of them, a massacre, because they made a deal with them that they could lease the land, but they could not call it their own. Now, why would they do that in 1637 to these nice Dutchmen? Well, because they've seen the horror and know of the horror that's happening in Virginia. By 1637 in Virginia, the Virginia governor has waged a war, has announced a war of extermination against all Indians. They know what's going on in New England, too. You know, you've seen the story of the first Thanksgiving, right? That's a happy story. Well, the very next spring, those same pilgrims, including Miles Standish, who was at that dinner, ended up moving up to Wessagusset, almost to what today is Boston, and attacking some of those same Indians. The same ones had saved them the year before, because there was another group of pilgrims wanting to farm up that way, and the Indians were giving them trouble about a land deal. And that started a war of extermination in New England. And by 1637, they had wiped out a whole tribe of people called the Pequots in one afternoon, killing 504 women and children at once at a massacre, destroying the whole nation. Lenni Lenape knew about this. They traded with the Wampanoags up in New England. They traded with the Powhatans in Virginia. They knew exactly what's happening in other places. And so when the Dutch come in and plant this thing, they're like, no. Killed every last one of them. The Swedes came in next, knew what happened in Swannendale. Hey, we're just here to farm a little bit. and they start to trade with the Indians. And so the Lenape make a stand here in Pennsylvania. You will not steal from us. You will not kill us and just take our land. You will deal with us. And so the Dutch end up dealing with them. And then the Swedes end up dealing with them. And when William Penn comes in 1682, he sits down and makes deals with them. And so Pennsylvania would be a peaceful place from 1637, after the Lenni Lenape said, no, you're not going to do this here, all the way until the French and Indian War in 1755. Right? So over a century of peace, thanks to the Indians, who made it clear that this is our land, you're not just going to take it from us because we have to farm it. but also thanks to the right Europeans making the right kinds of decisions. The Dutch decided after Swannenvale not to launch down a massive attack and try to kill everyone. Instead, they backed off. Like, geez, if we go in there and start killing all these people, we want to trade with them. We're not going to get any trading done, so let's just back away from there. We'll do another settlement someplace else. We'll make amends with them, and we'll keep making business. And the Swedes come in, hey, we want to make money, right? I saw out in the hallway there, somebody had a sign, make love, not war. Swedes, that was their motto, right? Make love, not war, go wherever we find. And they did. They intermarried with a lot of Indians, right? So there are a lot of Indian women and Swedish men, and you begin to see a mixed race culture developing in the Delaware River Valley. And then in the 1680s, we append a Quaker Society of Friends from England, whose religious principles tell him that these people have the light of God within them, and so he may not kill them. That's where Quaker pacifism comes from. But also, Penn wanted to make deals for the land because he got Pennsylvania as a payment for a debt owed to his father from the king. And the only way he could recoup that debt was to sell the land to other Europeans who had money. And he knows that if I'm going to sell this land, I've got to make nice with the Indians, because if it's a war zone, who's going to want to go and buy property? Anybody look at a property in Ukraine today? No, it's a war zone, right? No one wants to go there unless you want to go there to fight to help those people deal with their invasion, right? So Penn knows he's got to sell the land, so he's got a religious principle and a business principle that leads to the peace. And so from 1682 to 1755, peacefulness. This is not working. This way. Okay. So, one last thing, just to finish this up. What happens with Indians as they move out of the Delaware River Valley, because Penn buys them out? Well, they move to the Susquehanna River Valley, and they form a community along the Susquehanna, and they start calling themselves the Four Nations of Indians upon the Susquehanna. And they are Lenni Lenape and Shawnee, who are actually Algonquin cousins. And the Lenape invite the Shawnee to come live with them. But then also Susquehannocks that lived in that valley. And then the fourth nation were people called Piscataways, right, who are from Maryland, right, down the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay. And so what was happening here is Pennsylvania was becoming not just a place where Indians who were from here, like the Lenape and Susquehannocks, felt comfortable, but people like Shawnees who were coming up from Kentucky or from Ohio, coming back, or the Piscataways who came up from Maryland, or the Nanacoats who came up from the eastern shore of Maryland, or the Tuscaroras who come up from the Carolinas, or the Mohegans and Mohicans who come in from New England and northern Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania becomes a refugee zone for Indians. It becomes the most populous place for Indians in eastern North America because of Penn's policies. It's a place of peace. Right? And you think, wow, this is great. And they start calling themselves this to deal with the Pennsylvania government as one government of their own. And so there are four nations. Each of them have representatives. Their capital city is in a place called Conestoga, which is in Lancaster County. But then there were also towns up and down the Susquehanna River Valley. Conestoga might have been a town of about 800, 1,000, 1,200 people. There were other towns going all the way up into New York, like today's Cherry Valley, all the way up into western Pennsylvania, along the western part of the Susquehanna River, almost out to, well, geez, like where Juniata is today, and then down into Maryland. So they had dozens and dozens of these towns. The capital city was there in Lancaster and Conestoga. And they would all come together there for councils. And when they wanted to meet with Europeans would constantly call upon them and say, well, come to Philadelphia, come to New York, come to Williamsburg. And their answer was, you come to Conestoga. And they did, over and over again, right? And so these people ended up being pretty powerful. This is what they look like. So if you're looking for, what does a Pennsylvania Indian look like? Well, he doesn't have a big feather headdress, he doesn't ride a horse, he doesn't have a big spear, right? None of that, right? He's got a huge long bow here. This is before Columbus, what he would have been carrying. Wearing a cloth, right? So he's not running around naked. This is summertime. If it was wintertime, he'd have all kinds of furs over his shoulders. They were always clothed. Women were always clothed, modestly. You get these images from Europeans drawn in the 16th and 17th century, and most of them are drawn from the minds of Europeans having heard about Indians, having never seen one, right? And so that's where we get a lot of those ideas. And Europeans back home thought, well, these Indians are uncivilized because they're all naked in our pictures. And they're all naked in the pictures because some European who had never seen an Indian drew the Indian naked. And so that's what leads to the, and they also would draw pictures and write about the place being a forest primeval, about there never being any development there. And so people who came and settled here believed it. They believed it for years. Many people still believe it. Despite all the evidence that we have around us of these civilizations and who these people are. Oops, that one's a little bit off. So, there's a Lenny and Leslie family, right? Here's an image drawn by someone who was here and saw them, right? And everyone, including the children, fully clothed. No one wants to run around the woods naked. If you don't believe me, watch the show Naked and Afraid, right on the Discovery Channel, and you'll find nobody wants to do that. Nobody, right? All right, and more easy. So, and last but not least, they spread out. By the time you get to the 1730s, 40s, and 50s, settlers had pushed into the Susquehanna River Valley. So what do? They sold the lands there, because the Penn family, Penn's dead, but his family's still trying to buy this land. So they buy them out of the Susquehanna River Valley, and they move out here in western Pennsylvania, where they form 11 towns. And they start calling themselves the 11 Nations of Indians upon the Allegheny. One of those towns, my glasses on, so I can't see with my mask on anyway. Here we go. Is Conemaugh Old Town. That's Johnstown. This is Quamahoney. There's a lake on it now. Down here is Keckenpollin's Town. This is where Route 30 and the Somerset Pike intersect. Right? There was a town. That town was about 600 people. Conemaugh was anywhere between 1,500 and 2,000. If you go to Old Town Conemaugh in 1750, you would have seen streets, plural, laid out in a grid pattern. You would have seen log cabins that looked exactly like what European settlers were building. They had a store. They had churches. Right, all these sorts of things. But by the 1750s, many of these are Christians. Right, they've been baptized and what have you. There are missionaries that are coming to them. So that's what their lives looked like by that point. Was that one? So these people lived here until the 7 Years' War. And the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, for them, was actually their war of independence. By 1755, so many settlers had moved into western Pennsylvania and moved into their farming land and were hunting, were scaring away their game, were taking their land and their property. Then in 1755, they declared war on Pennsylvania and fought for 3 years, from 1755 to 1758. And this is the crazy thing. It's probably going to surprise all of you. They won. They won their war. And not just by a little bit, like by a landslide. But by the end of 1756, after a year, they had pushed settlement in Pennsylvania from western Pennsylvania, from where we are now, all the way inside Chester County and Bucks County and Philadelphia County, back down to what Pennsylvania was in 1700. And it stayed that way until 1758. And they've been so successful that when Forbes came in 1758 to cut his road to Pittsburgh, he saw what was going on in Pennsylvania and demanded that the governor of Pennsylvania, governor of Virginia, governor of New York, governor of Maryland all come together and meet with the Indians at Easton, Pennsylvania, and to make a deal with them to stop this. What did the Indians want? They wanted their sovereignty. They wanted to be dealt with as a sovereign nation, the 11 nations. 1. 2, they wanted a line of demarcation drawn at the Allegheny Mountain. Anything west of the Allegheny Mountains, Indian land, east of the Allegheny Mountain can be settlers, but settlers were not to come over. This is Indian country. It's our national border, right? So they want those things. 3, they want the whole army, the British army that's posted at Ligonier and Bedford and Pittsburgh, they want them to remove when the war's over. Once the fighting with the French is over, all those armies are removed. And what happens to those forts? The forts they want changed into trading stations. They win all of that in the Treaty of Easton. Every bit of it they win. This is the only time that this happens in the history of Native American-European relations in North America. It's a story that's just not told for some reason. Now here's what happens to it. How come we don't have this Indian nation anymore? Because as soon as the fighting ends in western Pennsylvania, Between 1758 and 1763, 5 years' time, 70,000 settler families, so you're talking 300,000 people, move in to the Monongahela, Allegheny, Stony Creek, river valleys, right, this whole area. 70,000 families move in and just overwhelm the 15,000 Indians trying to live in this region. Running away their game, farming on their farmland, and so Indians begin moving west again by the time you get to the American Revolution. Between 1760-ish and 1776, the land we're all sitting on right now was a bloodbath. It was a massive area of just nothing but fighting. What you start seeing after this 7 Years' War, after the Indians win their War of Independence, is a Pennsylvania first, and then later a United States war of ethnic cleansing, and sometimes genocide, that went on up until 1891, 1892, uninterrupted. It starts here though. It starts in Pennsylvania, which is really fascinating since this is the place that seemed to have the most hope compared to other places, but it comes here too. Hey, so I gave you enough on horticulture. I just wanted to give you a little bit on Indians or the region so you know a little bit about the place that you live. But thanks very much for having me here today and being such a great audience. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. You're welcome.